When Caleb opened his eyes that September morning in 1885, the Sonora desert sun was already burning his skin through the dusty window of his cabin. At 35 years old, he had built everything with his own hands. The ranch, the corrals, the life he had always dreamed of. But on that day, as he walked toward the stable to feed Thunder, his magnificent black stallion, something in the air felt different. The silence was too heavy, and the birds weren't singing. Thunder whinnied softly when he saw him approaching, as he had done every morning for 5 years. He was more than just a horse to Caleb. He was his companion, his confidant, the only family he had left after his parents died in the cholera epidemic that devastated the region. Caleb stroked the animal's neck, feeling the strength and loyalty that emanated from those dark, intelligent eyes. That's when he heard the sound of hooves approaching. Many hooves. Caleb ran to the window and his blood ran cold. A cloud of dust was rising on the horizon, and through it he could make out the silhouettes of at least 15 armed riders. He knew those dark figures. They were the Desert Dogs, the most feared gang in the entire territory, led by the cruel Bull Thorn, a man whose reputation for violence spread like wildfire through dry grass. There was no time to flee. Caleb ran to his rifle, but he knew he was outnumbered. As he loaded the weapon, a single question hammered in his mind. Why were they coming for him? He was just a simple rancher who raised cattle and lived in peace. The riders surrounded the property like hungry wolves. Bullthorn dismounted from his horse with the arrogance of someone who had never known defeat. He was an immense man, with scars that told stories of violence and eyes that seemed to have no soul. His men spread throughout the ranch, some pointing guns at Caleb, others already beginning to round up the cattle. "Caleb Morrison," said Thorn with a hoarse voice that sounded like stones being dragged. "I heard you have something that interests me." Caleb kept his rifle aimed, even knowing it was useless. "I don't have anything that's yours, Thorn. Get off my land." Thorn laughed, a sound that made the other bandits smile with malice. "Your land? Boy, you don't understand how things work around here. Everything I want, I take." His eyes fixed on Thunder, who was restless in the corral. "And I want that horse." "Thunder's not for sale," Caleb replied, feeling anger growing in his chest. Who said anything about buying? What happened next was a nightmare that unfolded in slow motion. Thorn's men advanced from all directions. Caleb managed to fire twice before being knocked down by a rifle butt to the head. As he fell, he saw Thunder being lassoed and dragged out of the corral, desperate whinnies echoing through the air. When Caleb regained consciousness, he was tied up inside his own house, which was now burning. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke burned his lungs. Through the window he could see the bandits taking his cattle, his horses, everything he had worked for. And Thunder. Thunder was being ridden by one of Thorn's men, fighting against the rains, his eyes desperately searching for Caleb. With strength he didn't know he possessed, Caleb managed to free himself from the ropes and escape the burning house seconds before the roof collapsed. He fell to his knees on the hot earth, watching his entire life turn to ashes. But that's when he noticed something strange. One of the bandits was messing with Thunder's saddle, storing something that looked like a piece of old leather. It was the map. Caleb had completely forgotten about it. It was an inheritance from his grandfather, a map that supposedly led to a legendary silver mine in the mountains. He had always thought it was just a family story, an old prospector's fantasy. But now, seeing the care with which the bandit stored it, he began to understand that perhaps there was more truth in those stories than he had imagined. The Desert Dogs left, leaving only destruction behind. Caleb remained there, alone in the midst of the ashes of his life, with only the clothes on his back and a thirst for justice that burned stronger than the fire that had consumed his house. At that moment, a truth crystallized in his mind. When everything you love is torn from you, only one choice remains. Let the pain destroy you or transform it into the strength that will rebuild you. The 5 years that followed transformed Caleb Morrison from a peaceful rancher into something completely different. The pain of loss and the thirst for justice molded him like iron is molded in fire. He became a bounty hunter, pursuing criminals throughout the territory, always with a greater goal in mind, finding the desert dogs and recovering Thunder. Every bandit he captured, every bounty he collected, was one step closer to his objective. Caleb learned to read tracks like other men read books, to shoot with deadly precision, and to survive in the most hostile places in the West. But more importantly, he learned that true strength doesn't come from violence, but from the unwavering determination to do what's right. His investigations led him through dusty towns and mining camps, always following clues about the desert dogs. He discovered that the gang had become even more powerful, controlling trade routes and extorting farmers throughout the region. But he also discovered something more disturbing. There were rumors that they were exploiting a silver mine somewhere in the mountains using slave labor. It was on a suffocating August afternoon in 1890 that Caleb finally arrived in Redemption Gulch, a growing town that had sprung up around a gold discovery. It was the kind of place where men came to start over or to hide from their past. The streets were a muddy mess of mud and manure, lined with saloons, gambling houses, and establishments of questionable reputation. Caleb tied his horse in front of the main saloon, the Golden Nugget, and pushed through the swinging doors. The place was full of miners, merchants, and questionable types, all drinking and gambling as if there were no tomorrow. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. He headed to the bar and ordered a shot of whiskey, his eyes discreetly examining the faces around him. He had learned to read people, to identify who might have useful information. That's when he heard a conversation at the next table that made his blood race. "Thorne said the mine's production increased this month," murmured a dirty-looking man. "Those workers are paying off well." "Watch what you say, Jake," replied another. "You know the boss doesn't like loose tongues." Caleb drank his whiskey slowly, pretending not to be paying attention. Then he got up and walked toward the door as if he were leaving. But he stopped abruptly when he saw something that made his heart almost stop beating. Outside, pulling a cart loaded with trash and debris, was a black horse. It was thin, dirty, with visible scars on its body, but Caleb would recognize that silhouette anywhere. It was Thunder. The horse that had once been the most beautiful animal Caleb had ever seen now looked like a ghost of itself. Its ribs were visible through its skin, and its eyes, once bright and full of life, now seemed dimmed by exhaustion and mistreatment. But when the wind carried Caleb's scent to him, something magical happened. Thunder raised his head abruptly, his nostrils flaring. For a moment that seemed like an eternity, the horse's eyes met Caleb's through the crowd. And then, as if 5 years of separation had never existed, Thunder reared up and let out a whinny that echoed throughout the main street. It was a sound of recognition, of joy, of longing. All the people on the street stopped to look, but for Caleb, the world had been reduced to just him and Thunder. Tears he hadn't shed in years began to burn his eyes. The man holding Thunder's reins, a short, fat fellow with dirty clothes, violently pulled the horse's head down. "Quiet, you useless animal," he shouted, raising a whip. But before he could use the whip, an iron hand grabbed his wrist. Caleb had moved faster than the wind, and now he was face to face with the man who was mistreating Thunder. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," said Caleb with a low, dangerous voice. The man looked at Caleb and saw something in his eyes that made him swallow hard. "Hey, relax, friend. It's just an old horse." "This horse has a name," Caleb replied, squeezing the man's wrist until he dropped the whip. "And he's not yours." "Of course he's mine. I bought him from Bull Thorne 3 years ago. I have the papers." Thorne's name made Caleb's blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Where can I find this Thorne?" The man hesitated, clearly realizing he had said too much. I don't know. He shows up around here from time to time, but..." Caleb released the man's wrist and approached Thunder. The horse lowered his head, allowing Caleb to touch his muzzle. It was as if the 5 years of separation had never existed. Thunder closed his eyes and rested his head on Caleb's chest, a gesture of trust and love that broke the man's heart. "How much do you want for him?" asked Caleb. "He's not for sale," the man replied, but his voice trembled. Caleb pulled out a bag of gold coins from his pocket, the result of 5 years hunting bounties. "This should be enough to buy 10 horses like him." The man looked at the gold with greedy eyes, but shook his head. I can't. If Thorn finds out I sold Thunder, he'll kill me. That's when Caleb understood. Thunder wasn't just a stolen horse. He was important to Thorn somehow. Maybe because of the map, or maybe for another reason he didn't yet understand. Then tell me where I can find Thorn, said Caleb, and you can keep the gold anyway. The man looked around nervously, then leaned closer. There's an abandoned warehouse on the east side of town. Thorn and his men meet there sometimes. But listen, stranger, if you have any sense, you'll forget about this horse and leave town. The desert dogs aren't people to mess with. Caleb nodded and handed some coins to the man. Take good care of him until I get back. And if I find out you hurt him, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The man swallowed hard and nodded quickly. As Caleb walked away, Thunder tried to follow him, but was stopped by the reins. The horse whinnied softly, a sound that broke Caleb's heart. But he knew he needed to be patient. First, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. That night, Caleb hid near the abandoned warehouse. It was a deteriorated wooden building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by wasteland and thorny bushes. For hours, nothing happened. Then, when the moon was high in the sky, he heard the sound of horses approaching. 5 men arrived at the warehouse, all armed to the teeth. Caleb recognized the type, experienced, dangerous bandits. But he didn't see Thorn among them. One of the men, apparently the group's leader, was a tall, thin fellow with a scar that ran from his forehead to his chin. Marcus said there's a stranger asking questions about Thunder, said the scarred man. Thorn won't like that. What kind of questions? Asked another. Wanted to know where to find the boss. Marcus thinks the guy knows the horse from somewhere. Caleb felt his heart race. They were talking about him. Well, if he knows Thunder, then he knows about the map, said a third man, and that means he could be a problem. Or an opportunity, replied the scarred man. If he knows something about that map we can't decipher, maybe we can use that to our advantage. Caleb frowned. They still had the map, but apparently couldn't understand it completely. That explained why Thunder was still important to them. Maybe there was something about the horse they needed. Either way, continued the scarred man, Thorn wants us to bring this stranger to him, alive if possible. The men spent a few more minutes discussing details, then mounted their horses and departed in different directions. Caleb waited until he was sure they had gone, then headed back to town. His mind worked quickly, processing the information he had heard. The desert dogs still had his family's map, but couldn't decipher it completely. And somehow Thunder was part of the equation. Maybe there was something in the horse's saddle, or maybe Thunder knew the way to the mine. But one thing was clear. He had been discovered. Thorn knew he was in town and would soon come after him. Caleb needed to act fast. The next morning, Caleb returned to where he had seen Thunder. The horse was tied behind a store, still pulling the garbage cart. Marcus, the fat man, was loading debris into the cart, cursing Thunder whenever the horse moved too slowly. Caleb watched from a distance, waiting for the right moment. When Marcus went into the store to get more trash, Caleb quickly approached Thunder. "Hello, old friend," he murmured, stroking the horse's neck. Thunder whinnied softly and rested his head on Caleb, as if saying he had missed him. That's when Caleb noticed something strange. Thunder kept looking in a specific direction, toward a narrow alley between 2 buildings. When Caleb followed the horse's gaze, Thunder began pulling in that direction, as if he wanted to show something. "What is it, Thunder? What do you want to show me?" The horse pulled harder, and Caleb decided to trust the animal's instinct. He quickly untied Thunder and followed him through the alley. The horse seemed to know exactly where he was going, turning corners and passing through alleys as if following a mental map. Finally, Thunder stopped in front of a 2-story building that appeared to be a boarding house. But it wasn't the main entrance that interested the horse. He was looking at a window on the 2nd floor, where a curtain moved slightly. Caleb understood immediately. Thunder had learned to recognize the desert dogs' hideouts during the 5 years he spent with them. The horse was showing where the bandits hid in town. At that moment, Caleb heard heavy footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Marcus running toward him, accompanied by 2 armed men. "Hey, horse thief!" shouted Marcus. "Get him!" Caleb didn't hesitate. He jumped onto Thunder's back and spurred the horse. Thunder, even after years of mistreatment, still had fire in his veins. He shot off like a bullet, leaving the pursuers behind in seconds. But Caleb knew there was no turning back now. He had revealed himself, and the desert dogs would come after him with everything. He needed to act before they organized themselves. As he rode through the streets of Redemption Gulch with Thunder, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years: hope, not just for having found his companion again, but because now he had an advantage the bandits didn't expect. Thunder knew their hideouts, their routes, their secrets. "Let's finish this once and for all, old friend," Caleb murmured in Thunder's ear. "Let's make these bastards pay for everything they did." Thunder whinnied in response, and Caleb could swear there was determination in that sound. Together again, they were more than man and horse. They were a force of nature, forged by injustice and tempered by the thirst for revenge. But Caleb knew the real battle was just beginning. Somewhere in town, Bullthorn was planning his next move, and this time there would be no mercy from either side. The war had begun. Caleb led Thunder out of town, looking for a safe place where they could hide and plan their next moves. He found a small cave in the rocky hills surrounding Redemption Gulch, a location that offered a good view of the town and several escape routes. While Thunder rested and fed on the sparse grass, Caleb carefully examined his companion. The scars told a story of 5 years of suffering, but the horse's eyes still shone with the same intelligence and loyalty as before. It was as if Thunder had kept his true essence, waiting for the day they would reunite. "They hurt you, didn't they?" murmured Caleb, running his hand over a particularly ugly scar on Thunder's flank. "But you endured. You knew I would come for you." Thunder rested his muzzle on Caleb's shoulder, a gesture that spoke louder than 1,000 words. At that moment, Caleb made a decision that would change everything. It was no longer just about revenge, it was about justice. And justice meant not only punishing the guilty, but freeing all those who suffered under the yoke of the desert dogs. When the sun began to set, painting the sky red like blood, Caleb saw a cloud of dust approaching the town. Even from a distance, he could count at least 20 riders. Thorn had arrived with reinforcements. "Looks like our presence caused a stir," said Caleb to Thunder. "Good. The more nervous they get, the more mistakes they'll make." Through his binoculars, Caleb watched the riders spread throughout the town. He recognized some faces from wanted posters he had seen over the years. These weren't common bandits. They were professional killers, men who killed for pleasure as much as for money. But it was when he saw Bullthorn dismounting from his horse in front of the saloon that Caleb felt the old rage resurface. The man seemed even crueler than 5 years ago, if that were possible. His clothes were expensive, his weapons gleamed, and he moved with the arrogance of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. Thunder also saw Thorn and began to get restless, his nostrils flaring and his muscles tensing. The horse remembered very well the man who had destroyed his peaceful life. "Easy, friend," said Caleb, stroking Thunder's neck. "Our time will come, but we need to be smart." As he watched, Caleb saw Thorn enter the saloon, followed by his lieutenants. Shortly after, Marcus, the man who mistreated Thunder, was dragged into the establishment by 2 bandits. Even from a distance, Caleb could imagine what was happening. Marcus was being interrogated about the stranger who had stolen Thunder. An hour later, Marcus came out of the saloon, staggering, clearly beaten. Thorn appeared in the doorway and shouted orders to his men. Immediately, groups of bandits began spreading throughout the town, obviously searching for Caleb. "They're going to search every corner of this town," murmured Caleb, "but they won't find us up here." As the night progressed, Caleb developed a plan. He couldn't face 20 armed men in direct combat. That would be suicide. But he could use the advantage Thunder gave him. The horse knew the bandits' hideouts, their routes, their habits. Caleb could use this information to divide and conquer. When the moon was high, Caleb mounted Thunder and silently descended toward the town. His first target would be the warehouse where he had seen the bandits meeting the night before. If he could capture some of Thorn's men and make them talk, he could discover the location of the silver mine. Thunder moved like a ghost through the shadows, his hooves making only the minimum necessary noise. It was as if the horse understood the importance of stealth. When they got near the warehouse, Thunder stopped and looked at Caleb, as if asking what the plan was. Caleb dismounted and examined the building. There was light coming from one of the windows, and he could hear low voices inside. He approached carefully and peered through a crack in the wooden wall. 3 men were sitting around a table, playing cards and drinking whiskey. Caleb recognized one of them. It was the scarred man he had seen the night before. The other 2 were strangers, but clearly gang members. "Thorn is furious," said the scarred man. 5 years looking for that damn map, and now someone appears who might know how to read it. "Do you really think this stranger is the horse's former owner?" asked one of the others. "Has to be. Thunder never reacted like that to anyone. And you saw how the horse followed him? It's like they've known each other for years. If he's the original owner, then he must know about the mine," said the third man. "Thorn will want to interrogate him personally. First we have to catch him," replied the scarred man. "And this guy doesn't seem like a common farmer. The way he moved today, he has training." Caleb smiled grimly. They were right. He was no longer the peaceful farmer he had been 5 years ago. Pain and the need to survive had transformed him into something much more dangerous. He decided it was time to act. He checked his weapons, 2 Colt .45s and a hunting knife, and prepared to enter. But before he could move, Thunder whinnied softly behind him. Caleb turned and saw that the horse was looking at something in the shadows. Following Thunder's gaze, Caleb saw 2 figures silently approaching the warehouse. They were more bandits, probably coming to join the others. Quickly, Caleb hid behind a pile of old crates and watched the 2 men enter the warehouse. Now it was 5 against 1. Worse odds, but still manageable if he was smart. He waited a few more minutes, then approached the back door of the warehouse. It was an old, poorly fitted door that creaked slightly when he opened it, but the sound was muffled by the laughter and conversations inside. Caleb entered silently, staying in the shadows. The interior of the warehouse was poorly lit by some lanterns, creating pockets of darkness where he could hide. He approached the table where the men were playing, his steps silent as a cat's. When he was just a few meters away, one of the men looked in his direction. For a moment, their eyes met through the gloom. The bandit opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Caleb was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew both Colts and pointed them at the group. "Nobody moves," he said with a low, dangerous voice. "Hands on the table where I can see them." The 5 men froze, their hands slowly moving to the table. But Caleb could see in their eyes that they were calculating their chances, looking for an opportunity to react. "You're going to answer some questions," continued Caleb, "and depending on the answers, maybe you'll get out of here alive." The scarred man was the first to speak. "You must be the stranger Thorn is looking for. You know you don't have a chance against all of us, don't you?" "Maybe not," replied Caleb, "but I can guarantee that at least 3 of you won't live to tell the story. The question is, who wants to be one of the lucky ones?" That's when one of the men at the end of the table tried to draw his weapon. Caleb didn't hesitate. His Colt fired, and the man fell backward, a red stain spreading across his shirt. The other 4 cowered, finally understanding they weren't dealing with an amateur. "Now that we've established the rules," said Caleb calmly, "let's get to the questions. Where is the silver mine?" "We don't know," replied the scarred man quickly. "Only Thorn and his closest lieutenants know the exact location." "Lie," said Caleb, pointing his gun at the man's head. "You transport supplies there. You have to know the way." All right," shouted another man. "It's in the Sangre Mountains, about 2 days' ride north, but it's well hidden, and there are guards everywhere." "How many men does Thorn have there?" "Maybe 15 or 20, plus the slave workers." Caleb felt his anger grow. "Slaves?" "Indians mostly," said the scarred man. "Some Mexicans too. Thorn captures them and forces them to work in the mine. Anyone who tries to escape," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Caleb could imagine the fate of those who tried to flee. "And the map?" asked Caleb. "Where does Thorn keep it?" The men exchanged nervous glances. Finally, one of them spoke. "He always carries it with him, never separates from it." "Why is Thunder important to him?" "The horse knows the way to the mine," replied the scarred man. Thorn has used him several times to guide supply caravans. The animal has an incredible memory, can find the way even in the dark. Caleb nodded. Now everything made sense. Thunder wasn't just a trophy for Thorn, he was a valuable tool, and that explained why the horse had been kept alive all these years, despite the mistreatment. "One last question," said Caleb. "Where can I find Thorn now?" "He's at the town hotel," replied one of the men quickly. "Presidential suite, but he has at least 10 men guarding the place." Caleb smiled coldly. "Thanks for the information." Before the bandits could react, Caleb knocked them out one by one with the butt of his gun. They weren't innocent men, but they didn't need to die either. At least not yet. He tied them up with ropes he found in the warehouse and left them there. When he left the warehouse, Thunder was waiting patiently for him. The horse whinnied softly when he saw Caleb approaching, as if asking if everything had gone well. "We got some useful information," said Caleb, mounting Thunder. "Now we know where to find Thorn, and more importantly, we know about the mine and the slaves." As they rode back to their hideout in the hills, Caleb processed the information he had obtained. The situation was worse than he had imagined. Thorn wasn't just a thief, he was a slaver, a man who profited from the suffering of innocent people. But there was also an opportunity. If Caleb could free the slaves from the mine, he would have allies in the fight against the desert dogs, and with Thunder to guide him, he could find the mine even if Thorn tried to hide it. When they reached the cave, Caleb dismounted and began planning his next move. He knew he couldn't attack Thorn directly at the hotel. There were too many guards, and too many innocents could get hurt, but maybe he didn't need to. If he could reach the mine first and free the slaves, he could use that as leverage against Thorn. The man would lose his source of income and his workforce all at once, and with Thunder to guide him, Caleb had an advantage Thorn didn't expect. "What do you think, Thunder?" asked Caleb, stroking the horse's neck. "Ready for a trip to the mountains?" Thunder whinnied and stamped his hoof on the ground, as if saying he was ready for anything. At that moment, Caleb felt a deep connection with his companion. They weren't just man and horse, but partners united by a common purpose. As the night progressed, Caleb finalized his plans. At dawn, he and Thunder would leave for the Sangre Mountains. They would find the mine, free the slaves, and then return to settle accounts with Bullthorn once and for all. But first, there was something he needed to do. Caleb took paper and ink from his backpack and began writing a letter. It was a message to the sheriff of Redemption Gulch, explaining the situation and asking for help. Even if the sheriff was corrupt or too cowardly to act, at least there would be a record of what was happening. When he finished the letter, Caleb tied it to the leg of a carrier pigeon he had captured. The bird flew toward town, carrying the message that could change everything. "Now it's just us two against the world, old friend," said Caleb to Thunder. "But it's always been that way, hasn't it? And we've always managed." Thunder whinnied softly in response, and Caleb could swear there was determination in that sound. Together, they had faced storms, predators, and the loneliness of the desert. Now they would face something much worse, human evil in its purest form. But Caleb wasn't afraid. He had learned a fundamental truth during his years as a bounty hunter. Evil may be powerful, but it's never stronger than the determination of a righteous man fighting for what's right. And for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Morrison knew exactly what his purpose was. It wasn't just about personal revenge. It was about justice for all those who had suffered at the hands of the desert dogs. The final battle was approaching, and this time he wouldn't fight alone. He had Thunder by his side, and together they were a force that not even Bullthorn could stop. Dawn brought with it the promise of a new day, and with it, the hope that justice would finally prevail. Caleb mounted Thunder and looked one last time at Redemption Gulch, where light still shone in the windows of saloons and hotels. "Let's finish this," he murmured to Thunder. "Let's bring these bastards to justice and free all the innocent people they've enslaved." Thunder whinnied in response and began galloping toward the distant mountains, carrying Caleb toward the confrontation that would define not only his destiny, but the destiny of all those who had suffered under the yoke of tyranny. The journey to redemption had begun, and nothing in the world could stop them now. If you enjoyed this story of courage, loyalty, and justice, please like and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming Old West stories that touch the heart and awaken the best in each of us.